Can you see that? Okay.
That's great.
I love that. I could. Actually, it's posted on my Facebook page.
Okay.
I even share. I went and found it because I posted it a couple years ago, and the U.S. Declaration of Independence claims for us the right to pursue happiness, and boy, do we ever. But few have it for long. The secret of happiness may not be what we think it is. In fact, it may be counterintuitive to what we think it is. So in a laundromat one morning, I saw a newspaper that said it was devoted to preserving our right to, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote. The few articles I scanned were primarily whining about anything that might impinge on my rights to pursue what? Clearly, in the author's opinions, they were pursuing what should lead them to happiness. There was a lot of blaming others for taking or trying to take happiness from them. Shantideva taught, in samsara, the causes of happiness rarely occur, while the causes of suffering are innumerable. So before pursuing happiness, picture this balloon, this person chasing these balloons. Before pursuing happiness, we might want to investigate its causes. Remember, everything that comes to us in this realm is a matter of causes and conditions. They're karmic. So if we want happiness, we need to pursue its causes. We need to understand what happiness is, what are the causes of happiness. Otherwise, we might be pursuing the wrong thing. And Wang Mo led us in a nice discussion how ordinary happiness actually leads to suffering. So ordinary happiness, what we think of as happiness, is not a cause of happiness. Something else is. So we want to know, what is happiness? And what a waste of precious life energy to erroneously be pursuing the wrong thing. Shantideva, I recommend The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva if you want to attain happiness. He says, although living beings wish to be free from suffering, they run straight toward the causes of suffering. Why? Because they think it's going to bring them happiness. And although they wish for happiness, out of ignorance, they destroy it like a foe. Why? Because they think the causes of suffering are happy. They think the causes of happiness will actually bring them suffering. We're talking about an incredible ignorance, a really amazing crossed wire. So if we really want to pursue happiness, we need, what is happiness and what are its causes? So before I ask you what is happiness and let you come discuss it, I want to give you a little bit of history of happiness in Western philosophy. And this is like the briefest overview of happiness in Western philosophy. And so since it's Western philosophy, I'm going to start back with ancient Greece. And a couple of the ancient Greek philosophers decided that happiness was a result of virtue. That was their thought. Happiness was a result of virtue. We come to the Middle Ages, and people were pretty dirt poor, and life was really difficult. And there was a lot of, the very few people who were in power and had a life of ease. And the teachings then were that happiness is not something that is reasonable to pursue in this life. It's not going to happen. Happiness is something that you gained in heaven after this life. So you couldn't even pursue happiness. It wasn't even reasonable to do. Then the Reformation came along, and at that point came a whole new thought about happiness, that it's attainable, and then we have the right to pursue it, and that is what's reflected in our Declaration of Independence, the right to pursue happiness, and that one of these things then would be freedom, the freedom to pursue happiness in any way that we think will bring us happiness. And I certainly can't argue with the idea of freedom and the right to pursue happiness. What they never guaranteed was that we would find it or gave us any roadmap on how to do so successfully. And so again, we're back to this. What is happiness and what are its causes? So I'm asking you, what is happiness?
I have a couple thoughts. I think to the point you were just talking about in terms of the origins of our country, the Declaration of Independence. It seems to me that the right to pursue happiness, that form of happiness would be a freedom from the previous suffering that would have impinged that ability to pursue that, like an oppressive government, that they were really declaring their independence and trying to defend the rights of those people on this land from. And so for them, happiness would have been becoming free from that.
Freedom from this obvious outer oppression.
Freedom from that previous suffering that they had.
You know, that almost strikes me like the walking too much makes you suffer because you're tired, that Wanmo was talking about. Mm-hmm. And you sit down to rest and it feels so good. So it's that
It's
freedom from oppression.
or freedom from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
By
Mm-hmm.
definition, it would be you're then free of that.
Right. And if we look at that, if we look at some of the third world countries where there's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of war in some of them, we don't live there. By default, then, we ought to be happy. And yet we look at how much of our life we are dissatisfied. We are not happy. So even now that we've been free from that kind of oppression, we might think, oh, I'm oppressed by this, or I'm oppressed by that. We're not oppressed by what those people are oppressed by. We're free from that. So it's a step toward happiness. You had something you were going to say.
I was saying if all suffering is due to confusion, and to me happiness would be clarity, very clear understanding of reality and how the world actually works. So yeah, I sense, and again, I guess you have to think of what you define by happiness, but I would certainly think, is freedom from suffering happiness? Probably. Or maybe that's bliss, or I don't know how the vocabulary would work. For me, it would be very clear understanding of how the world works, clear thinking.
Clear. So a clarity that doesn't confuse.
Yeah.
If freedom from suffering were bliss, then as soon as suffering were relieved, it would seem we should feel bliss. Unless, in fact, it's the all-pervasive suffering that separates us from bliss, if bliss is our natural state. And so that's sort of like beneath our awareness, but blocking something.
So you're saying that the relief of suffering is not necessarily the direct cause of happiness.
That's true. I don't believe that suffering and happiness are actually two ends of the same spectrum. I think there's this spectrum of suffering and there's this spectrum of happiness, and whereas they can correlate, they're not the same continuum. There's a lot of things. The spectrum of impatience and the spectrum of patience are not the same continuum. The spectrum of hope and the spectrum of hopelessness are not the same continuum. There's many things when you start digging into it, what seems to be the opposite is actually a related but different phenomenon. Because you can be hope and hopeless simultaneously. One problem is that we have crossed wires. We have and continue to confuse happiness with pleasure. Shanti Deva said, if we consider all the hardships we have endured since beginningless time in pursuing meaningless worldly pleasures, we could have attained the state of a Buddha for a fraction of the difficulty. Every time I read that, I'm like, duh. Damn! If we consider all hardships we have endured since beginningless time pursuing meaningless worldly pleasures that we thought were going to bring happiness, we could have attained the state of a Buddha for a fraction of the difficulty. The crossed wire, one of them anyway, a big one in human realm, is a confusion between pleasure and happiness, which is why the chocolate cake didn't bring happiness. It brought a temporary pleasure. Life can seem like a random series of distressing and joyful events, punctuated by occasional periods of calm before the next storm. And I think it's anticipating, this is wonderful, but the next storm is coming. I might wish for more control over life, but the only thing that I can actually control is my own response to the ups and downs of what seems to be going on out there. So Shantideva in this book also taught, I will not allow anything that happens to me to disturb my mental peace. My mental peace. If I become unhappy, I shall be unable to fulfill my spiritual wishes, and my practice of virtue will decline. He's making a very, kind of a subtle but a very strong point here, is unhappiness is anything that disturbs my mental peace. Therefore, happiness is mental. Happiness is mental. It's not any outer condition. Happiness is in the mind, just as suffering is in the mind. And if I allow mental unhappiness to arise, I won't be able to fulfill my spiritual wishes, and my practice of virtue will decline. I want to remind you that the Greeks said happiness is a result of virtue. Now, just to explain that this is not just a bunch of philosophy, I want to tell you physiologically why pleasure cannot bring happiness. There are several pleasure pathways in the brain that they have identified, and they can identify, if they're measuring, they can identify when there's a hit on a pleasure pathway. And while it's not the only thing this neurotransmitter does, a very important and necessary neurotransmitter for these pleasure pathways is dopamine. Dopamine does other things in the body, and I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to dopamine's effect in the pleasure pathways. So eating the chocolate cake, you get a hit of dopamine. For somebody who's addicted to something, you have it, you get a hit of dopamine. And then it gets to the point, if you don't have it, then there will be a pathway that seems dopamine deprived, and you will suffer, the side effects of withdrawal. Now, dopamine degrades in these pathways at different speeds, mostly measured in microseconds. The longest one is like maybe 2 seconds, and it will degrade. 2 seconds, and it will degrade. So you have that Lay's potato chip, and you get a hit of dopamine. And by the time you're finished swallowing it, that pleasure pathway, that signal of pleasure has degraded. So what do? You eat another potato chip, and you get another hit, but it's not quite as good. I mean, the first chip, the first bite of chocolate cake, the first piece of anything that tastes good tastes the best. After that, you don't get the same. So you eat more and more and more, trying to get this same dopamine response, and it can't be done. And then you overdo it, and then you get all the other responses of having overdone it that cause you suffering because you're bloated, and you know the whole having eaten whatever the unhappiness. And so anything that brings us ordinary happiness to me, in my mind, ordinary happiness equals pleasure. Pleasure can't last. Pleasure can't last. It doesn't last. It will lead us in the direction of suffering inevitably if we get sucked into the pursuit of pleasure. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have pleasure or pleasant things, What it means is pursuing it will not bring us happiness. Eventually, it will bring us mental unhappiness. And as Shanti Deva said, it will disturb our mental peace. We'll be unable to fulfill our spiritual wishes, and our practice of virtue will decline. So that's why the pursuit of ordinary happiness is a dead end. So what is real happiness? And how do we pursue it? Think of the times in your life where you've been really happy. What have they been?
Well, it seems like one road we could go down is saying that happiness would be a reduced sensory environment and a very calm state of mind that's not very stimulated. Just staying within that mental space.
I've read that solitary confinement drives people crazy. That if you were in a totally environment with no stimuli, it would drive you crazy. Although I have heard meditators say, let me try it for a while.
Right, I mean, that's the Theravada path. That's Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah. Why would an ordinary environment drive people crazy, but you get dedicated meditators saying, give me a chance to see if that's really true? You put the dedicated meditator into the environment with no outer stimuli. Would it drive them crazy or not? And why or why not? And since we don't have one of those environments to experiment, it's a thought experiment here.
I think ordinary happiness happiness, actual happiness, doesn't actually depend on any external external factor. It depends on internal factors. So it doesn't matter if you're in solitary confinement or not. You know, I think that it's the mental factors that people go into solitary confinement with that actually produce that result.
No, that's a very powerful statement. It's the mental factors that people go into solitary confinement with that produce that result. And the mental factors that usually result in solitary confinement would be anger, aggression. What would cause someone to be put in solitary?
Well, I think Nelson Mandela was in solitary confinement, so...
He didn't go crazy, did he?
But he didn't go crazy. And so that was, but he also wasn't, I don't think, angry.
Right. And he's notable for the fact that he wasn't. So, and I think that's why you could put a dedicated meditator in one of these sensory deprived environments for a while, and they would be just happy as a clam, because what are they doing in there? Meditating. Which is?
Generating virtuous activity.
Generating virtuous mental states of mind. Generating virtuous mental states. Isn't this basically what we're doing when we're meditating? Is we're generating virtuous mental states of mind. So we go back to what the ancient Greeks said. Happiness is a result of virtue.
I also think that when you refer to solitary confinement, that has a negative connotation, where if some people may look at it as retreat. So it depends on the state of mind that you go into it with.
When we are overcome with distressing emotions such as fear, betrayal, worry, anger, jealousy, they feel very real. However, if we think about the future, we're going to realize as we look back that those things will have been gone unless we hang on to them. That period of time of life, those states of mind will be gone. They'll pass because they're illusions produced by our mind in response to some confusion. And so we're coming back to, if we don't have the confusion, talking about the clarity that you were speaking of. Shanti Deva said, because they're like illusions, I should banish fear from my heart and strive to attain wisdom. Therefore, having considered this well, I will strive sincerely to practice these precepts. Sometimes all we really need to do is be reminded, oh, I've been pursuing the wrong things. Whoops, now I remember. Sometimes we just need to be reminded. And Shantideva explained, it is precisely because things lack inherent existence that it is possible that suffering can be cut. Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this topic. I hope this is on target, on topic. But I've been thinking a lot about this and how ultimately happiness isn't dependent upon external environment, and yet we still have a very rapid pace of living. We have a lot of sensory stimulation in our environment. We have a lot of cognitive load, which can be considered high cognitive load, which can be considered stress. We have, you know, anger and, you know, very angry people in our environment, very stressed out, or, you know, aggressive people in our environment. So you can look at the environment as a very challenging, very difficult. We can look at sometimes our home lives when we're caretakers for maybe somebody with dementia. You know, you can look at and come up with so many examples of, I have a very difficult environment in which I live. Mm-hmm. And yet there's still this possibility of unhooking our perception that happiness is dependent upon that factor. And the challenge is, you know, I think it's more, the more challenged you are, sometimes the more difficult it is to learn. But it's still possible. I mean, what you're saying, Tinchin, and what Shantideva is saying is, it's still possible. You know, no matter what.
No matter what your conditions, it's still possible.
Mm-hmm. And if we still have those crossed wires, we could still rejoice that and have confidence that
it's uncrossable. That we can.
Uncrossable at some point.
And the path of Dharma then is the path to lead us in that direction. So it's kind of nice to know what the secret is, which I'll actually get to. Shantideva tells us. So one of the points we wanted to make in this teaching is the end point of samsara is suffering. Have we convinced you? Have we persuaded you that the end point of samsara is suffering? We want to convince you that the end point of the Dharma is happiness. So while studying the Dharma is essential, because we're not going to know, you know, we're not going to have basic knowledge to even know what to pursue if we don't study the Dharma. If that's all we do, if all we do is study, then we'll become a wonderful encyclopedia of knowledge. But what will we do when it is time to benefit others? In order to make transformations that are necessary to becoming, to actually incorporating these realizations into our lives, if we haven't practiced what we've learned, it is all for naught. Now, one of the problems with practicing is we really want to be skillful and expert at what we practice. Therefore, in the beginning, when we practice and we're not so good at it, and we practice and we fail, and we practice and we're clumsy, and we practice and we're awkward, we practice and it's not pretty because we're not good at it yet. Oh my gosh, I have so much respect for Dewanima because she has this smile and encouragement on her face as she listens to all these newbies trying to learn the piano with a guitar. And I know because she teaches me guitar, and you're saying, because your children take piano lessons from her. Okay, so I mean, we have to go through that stage of awkward clumsiness as we begin. That's why they call it practice. And there's been a lot of research that how many hours do you have to practice something before you become competent? How many? It's like 50,000? I thought it was 50,000. It's a lot.
It's 10,000 you had to become competent. I mean,
10,
high level competent in any skill.
Okay, so 10,000 to become just base level competent at any skill?
That's 3 hours a day every day for almost 3
3 hours a day, every day for almost 3 years. So if you're only putting in an hour a day, we're talking 9 years.
I hope it doesn't take my kids that long to learn to
No,
write twice.
well, I think like very, very efficient.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, Pema.
But another crossfire that we have is that failure is suffering.
Right.
And
Rather
in
than progress
actuality,
on the path.
in studies where they've compared, sort of doing something that's familiar or just giving the answers to people who actually have to attempt to solve a problem, and then they typically fail the first time because they don't know much about it. When they compare those situations, what they find is that people who fail actually learn more, they learn better, they learn faster, and they retain the information better over time. So failure, we think it's unhappiness, but failure is actually can be a source of happiness, because if you're studying the Dharma, it's leading you toward a virtuous and desirable result, and you're failing at it, you're probably learning more about the Dharma than you think you are.
And in a year or 5 years, you're not going to be failing at the same things. You're going to be much further along. There will be a certain baseline of suffering that's gone as you move forward into new understandings. So, Shanti Deva said we need to put the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, into practice, because nothing can be accomplished by just reading words. A sick man will never be cured of his illness through merely reading the medical instructions. Was there somebody who wanted to say something that I missed?
Oh, I was just going to throw in something, an anecdote on payment.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I was just throwing something around. Anecdote around payment. I said I read that when American and Japanese school children enter the first grade, they tested about the same level in mathematics. When they exit the 6th grade, the Japanese children are testing at a much more advanced level. And some American teachers went over to study why this is. And they found that in Japanese classrooms, when the kids are coming to a new problem type that they haven't seen before, the teacher just puts it on the board and asks all the students to propose solutions. And then the teacher doesn't say anything, and they wait an inordinately long time for a student to suggest a solution, and of course that doesn't work, and another student suggests one. And they learn all the ways that it doesn't work. They fail repeatedly, and then they finally get it. In an American classroom, the teacher says, now we're going to do a quadratic and 3 equation, and this is how you do it. So American students only learn what works. They don't learn all the blind alleys of what doesn't work. They don't learn all the failures. And then when they're presented with a new novel situation, if they don't know exactly what is going to work, then they get high levels of stress and they give up very quickly.
That's very, very interesting. And it's also interesting that often the Dharma is taught in not this, not that. Just along those lines. What is emptiness? Well, it's not this and it's not that, and it's not this and it's not that, and it's not this and it's not that. So that you have to sort of figure out, by knowing everything it's not, again, you don't go down those
It's into what you said about the intellectual understanding not being enough. Same thing in like 12-step programs for recovery from addiction and alcoholism. They say that recovery is not something you figure out, it's something you do. You actually have to be doing it, whatever the things are on a day-to-day basis.
That makes sense.
Enlightenment is probably the same.
Now, I know that...
I'm just thinking of Buddha. Yeah, he did sit under the Bodhi tree and figure it out in one night. But that was after, how many years
of trying different approaches. Yeah.
If he sat under the Bodhi tree at the beginning of that 6 years,
he would have been sitting maybe too long, gotten sore, but it was shady, right?
So I have another obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Pema.
Well, I liked his point because, one of the analogies that we often use is around attachment and aversion. And I think attachment is sort of, and grasping is sort of a mild form of addictive behavior. It's not really I wouldn't call it, I mean, sometimes we're conscious of our grasping, but I wouldn't really call it conscious, like we don't choose to grasp.
But it's grasping after some kind of a pleasure, so it's which
Yeah.
gives us the dopamine hit, so it is an
So it's
addictive.
kind of like a compulsion, and,
Mhm.
you know, and so the Dharma is really saying, you know, how to free ourselves from that kind of pattern.
Now, I want to bring us back to and feed off a point that Jugni said earlier. So he was talking about the Hinayana, or should I say the Theravadan path to freedom, would be freedom from suffering, which would be, we call cessation, or he was likening it to the environment where there is no stimuli, but then there's no grasping after stimuli, but there's this cessation of stimuli. In the Mahayana Great Vehicle, we practice what's called mind training. Now, mindfulness is associated with the Theravadan path, and it is a very important basic skill. It is not something that as Mahayanas we ignore. It's an important basic skill to have. But in mindfulness, we observe without judgment, which gives us the ability to observe. And it not only gives us the ability to observe, but it gives us the ability to observe if we observe without judgment, without arising negative states of mind in response to what we see. But in mind training, we observe, but then we attach the Mahayana agenda, which is to train the mind in compassion. So we start with mindfulness, and then we move forward with the motivation to transform, because it recreates us as one who's able to help others. Now we're going to come to the point where I'm going to give away the secret that many of you already know. The secret to happiness. I tried to teach it to my students when I remember specifically at MSOE as an instructor. I tried to teach my students because they were world-class complainers. Not all of them, but as a group, they were world-class complainers. But they were really not all that different from the rest of their generation. They were world-class complainers because their generation are world-class complainers. Because that's what they've done and been taught to do from the time they started watching cartoons that had first graders saving the world because the mayor was too dumb. Okay? They have been taught to be first-class complainers. And it became apparent. We had one new faculty member who came in, and she was so excited to be working with students at the college level, because a number of years ago she had worked with students in junior high, and they were such complainers that it just drove her nuts. And she was so happy to, and we were counting it up, and we're like, I'm sorry to tell you this, dear, but these are the same kids, just older. It's not an age effect, it's a generational effect, and you've just got the same kids, only older. Now, I have to say, as a parent to that generation, I made the same mistakes the other parents did. But I didn't know it was a mistake. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we reverse this mistake? And some of the other faculty members and I would try to figure out, how do we reverse this mistake that we made in raising this generation? So there were a number of different ways, and some of them really began to show good effects. But there's this one time I had a group of students in the lab, and this really had nothing to do with the lab, but I had them in clinicals, and I had them in the lab, and I had them in the classroom, and they were doing their usual complaining about this, that, and anything in life. And I was trying to teach them the secret to happiness. I said, it's simpler than you think. I said, imagine one of them worked as a nurse tech in a mother-baby unit in one of the larger hospitals in the city. And I said, I want you to imagine that this mom and baby are being discharged, and you've got them in the wheelchair, because they always wheel moms out. They're not going to let them walk carrying the baby. What if they should fall? Hospital liability. So they put them in a wheelchair, and they wheel them out, and mom's holding the baby, looking at the baby, and smiling at the baby, and really happy and thrilled and excited going home with this baby. And you wheel mom out of the front, and you wait, and dad drives up in the car, and dad gets out, and he's just smiling, and they're smiling at each other, and they're smiling at the baby. And I painted this whole scene of You know, here you are watching all this smiling and the baby, and they're so happy. And she just sat there with this amazing smile on her face as I'm painting this picture for her. I said, and then they get in the car and they drive away and they never say thank you. I'm like, wait a minute, what happened? 5 seconds ago you were smiling. And now you're like dejected. What happened? What happened?
She looked at herself.
She looked at herself. When she was looking at them, and they were happy, and she was rejoicing in their happiness, she was happy. And the instant she turned around and looked at herself, she became unhappy. And just to make the point, it was all illusory. I was telling a story. It wasn't even happening. And that's the difference. When you look at others, you're not unhappy. You're happy. And when you're looking at yourself, you're unhappy. And it's seriously, I promise you, it is that simple. Yes?
But it's not that easy.
No, I didn't say it's easy. I said it's simple.
We've known that for many, many years, and we've practiced and practiced. And I mean,
No, we practice looking at ourselves.
We have a great community, and we can see that in the community, even over years, you know, people are still, they know this, and they've been practicing not doing it, and yet they still.
We're addicted to looking at ourselves, and that's why it takes practice. And sometimes we need to be reminded. We need to be reminded. But the thing is, often we don't actually practice. Mind training, Buddhist mind training or Lojong, is literally practicing compassion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Compassion is you're looking at others and you have a desire to relieve their suffering. So Shantideva said, and we was talking about we know the secret. If we know the secret and we actually believe the secret, and like we've been taught it by our teacher, Domo Geshe Rinpoche, we know the secret, but practicing the secret is what makes it. We're so addicted, we're used to looking at ourselves. It's like, she says, we have this continual meditation upon ourselves. The Mahayana Great Vehicle practice of mind training, this is where it goes beyond observing, is we actually observe with an agenda. Shantideva taught the defining characteristic of guarding alertness is to examine again the state of our body, speech, and mind, and to understand whether or not our actions are correct or not. Might I say, maybe to understand whether or not we're looking at ourselves again. Buddhism teaches that we've circled in samsara, the unenlightened state, for so long that all living beings have. Now this is a way to help us retrain our minds. That all living beings have in one life or another been dear to us. Each was our mother or father or best friend. They were dear to us in some way. Only now we've forgotten. And we erroneously believe that some are enemies and most are strangers. But Shantideva taught, when I see other beings, I should think, I can attain enlightenment, independence on these living beings, and cherish them sincerely. I should perform all actions for others' happiness. This quality is precious and rare, and through it I shall enjoy the pure happiness and joy that arises from actions that benefit others. So it's a matter of reminding ourselves. There's many mind training texts. And when Pema and I were at the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama a few months ago, one of his recommendations was to memorize the 8 verses of thought transformation. Because if we have them memorized, which we probably don't. In the moment we need them, they'll arise. But they can't arise unless we memorize them. So I was thinking, well, how do we memorize them? Well, we need flashcards. So, I mean, I really tried. I need some more work. But I got these things for making business cards you can print out on the computer, and they have the 8 verses for training the mind on them. I'm still working on making them look pretty. But here they are, and there was an extra one, so I put a pretty picture. So I have these little sets of 8 verses for training the mind. And I brought a few with me. I'm still working on making them look prettier and having nicer cards. But if anybody wants to practice and take a set of these so that you can carry them with you, and you can start on the first one, however you memorize, but they're your flashcards for memorizing the 8 verses for training the mind and having it with you. I brought a couple sets with me, and I will again work on making them prettier. But the secret to happiness is working for the welfare of others and not looking at yourself. Because whether you're feeling arrogant and egocentric, or whether you're feeling down, having pity for yourself and I'm so bad, those are actually 2 ends of the same spectrum, and the spectrum is me. And anywhere along the spectrum of me, you're going to be unhappy. Anywhere on the spectrum of me. Whether it's self-esteem or self-denigration, it's a spectrum of self. And the spectrum of self always leads to unhappiness. And when we become off the spectrum of self and are working for the welfare of others, that leads to happiness. Even if what we're doing goes wrong or doesn't have always the best result. That's the whole idea of gaining skillful means. Practicing, well, this didn't work, that didn't work, what does work? Skillful means is how to benefit others, because others are all different. So it's going to take a plethora of skillful means to actually be able to accomplish it. How I benefit this individual isn't going to work for that, or necessarily that, or necessarily that. So it's going to take a long time, but that's okay because I'm working on it. But it's on the spectrum of other, and it's the spectrum of other that leads us to happiness. Does that make sense? Anybody have any experiences to share or thoughts on that?
It's kind of ironic because yesterday afternoon, for some reason, the movie The Secret, I was just thinking about it, came to mind, The Secret, and thinking of how they built the movie up. The first 20 minutes is all the ancient Egyptian cultures. They really get you like on the edge of the seat to hear what the secret is, and then, you know, we find out what it is. It's, you know, sort of ends up being fairly worldly, I think.
It's how to make life better for me.
Right, how
Yeah.
to learn to manipulate your life to get more of what you want in an outer way. And, you know, I don't know why I was thinking about it, but that was just really mine. And you kept saying the secret to happiness, we're going to tell you the secret to happiness, the secret, the secret. She's using like the same way.
I get you on the edge of your seat. What's
but
the
I like this one better.
This is a better secret. And can you see why we have this crossed wire? Why we think that what is going to bring us happiness is getting things for me brings us suffering. And why we think what's going to bring us suffering, which is not trying to get things for me. And we're afraid perhaps someone's going to take advantage of us. So we don't do it. And that's actually what would lead to happiness. So you go back to Shanti Davis. Go back to what Shanti Davis said, knowing what leads to happiness. Now listen to what he said. Although living beings wish to be free from suffering, they run straight toward the causes of suffering. And although they wish for happiness, out of ignorance, they destroy it like a foe.
I think it's a pretty profound concept that, oh, how do I want to say this? I mean, I'm back to happiness. You can have a happy mind no matter what situation you're in. Just kind of a fundamentally happy mind, no matter what situation that you're in. And that, it took me a long time to understand what that actually meant. You know, like that's why the comments about, it's not easy, it's not necessarily easy, it's a simple concept.
But it's not easy to
Not
accomplish.
necessarily easy, it's
Yes.
not necessarily difficult either, but I think for a lot of us, we have so many cross wires from our cultural training that it can be a little bit of a challenge.
It's more than
But-
just cross wires from our cultural training. It's cross wires from being in conditioned existence, because
Yeah.
it's the same in all
Yeah.
other cultures and other realms.
That's true. Although
Although we have our specific cultural cross wires, it's not like if we didn't have this culture and these crossed wires, we wouldn't have crossed wires. We would.
I think you do see some spiritual communities, though, where the values are a little bit different than in the West, and where some of these concepts are understood much earlier on. And I would say they tend to be generally happier. Like Bhutan even focuses on gross national
Happiness, they do.
So I'm not saying whether they're successful or not, but I think that kind of mentality might allow us to practice this earlier on and not have so many difficulties with it. But I do agree also everyone has challenges. But it's when a person discovers that their happiness is not dependent on others, it can be kind of intimidating, but it's really, in fact, very liberating. It's very freeing, because
You mean not dependent on outer conditions?
yeah. Because you don't have to just make dinner taste great in order to feel good. You don't have to make sure everybody is on time in order to feel okay or be happy. You don't have to get the chocolate cake every night in order to be, you know, or the toy or the job or the, you know, whatever it is. If only you had it, you would be happy. And it's completely dependent upon circumstances that are beyond your control. And yet, if it's just something that you can work on in your internal environment, you know, then you're freed from an endless negotiation for external factors to comply with what you want in order to be happy.
I like that. Free from an endless external negotiation for outer factors to be what you want in order to be happy.
Really, it is.
It is. That's a lot of our life is what it is.
Remember Jay was talking about abandonment issues, and, you know, feeling abandoned is a very difficult feeling. And there are times when people are actually abandoned in different ways. But in my life, having a endless negotiation for people to just comply with not abandoning me in difficult situations.
Which is basically, if you think about it, it's not just complying with people not to abandon you, but it's asking people to comply with your perception of what abandonment and not abandonment is. So it's like if you have this issue, you paint the world with it, and then you ask people not to do it, and they can't not do it because they've already been painted with it. So I mean, like my issue, yours is abandonment. I have a different one, but I can paint the world with it just as easily.
And, you know, I'm not saying that abandonment issues don't need to be healed. I'm just saying that when we are in a constant negotiation for people to comply so that difficult thing won't actually happen to us, or that happy thing will actually happen to us, it's a tremendous consumption of energy. And when all of that is done, and we no longer have to do that endless negotiation, then all of that energy can be just freed up for feeling lighter and being happier.
And I think that would be part of the healing process. It may not be all of it, but it's a huge step in the healing process.
I'm mulling all of this over and how I'm going to turn it into a lesson for my children in their moments of unhappiness right now that they are experiencing.
My recommendation with children is to redirect their attention and engage them in serving others. Now, it's sort of a very interesting experience I had about a month and a half ago. In fact, it would have been it would have been maybe 2 weeks before then. Maybe 3 weeks before retreat started. I was at one of the book clubs that I do at Tokemes twice a month. And a woman came who comes rarely but does sometimes come, and she's a vet, and she's a dog trainer, and she takes dogs who have abandonment issues or traumas or difficulties, and she retrains them. And she went on and on and on. I found it very interesting. I thought, we have lunch together, and then we have book club. So during this time, she was going on and on and on and on and on. And she told me later she could figure out why she was going on. And I thought it was very interesting. But one of the things she said is that dogs enjoy barking. To them, it's enjoyable to bark. And notice they basically have one volume. Each dog has one volume. And humans sort of don't like to hear dogs bark. Though if you watch them, if you look at their tails that they're wagging, it's not aggressive. Even if they're coming at you, it's a joyful coming at you. They're barking, barking, barking. You think they're barking at you, but their tail's wagging. They're saying, come play with me. Come bark with me. When humans yell at them, shut up, you, whatever, they understand that loud voice to be barking. Oh, goody. The human has joined me in the bark fest. And if you look at it, no dog that is yelled at stops barking, because from their point of view, the human has joined them in the party. They are now all barking together. But that's just how humans bark. They're not all that good at it. And so if you want to stop a dog from barking, you engage them. And the people who are successful with Richie comes barking at them, they reach down and engage Richie. You engage them, and then you redirect them to a different activity. I told this to the teacher down the road who's got 2 big dogs in her yard, and when I go by to go to the post office to collect the mail, they come barking up at the fence. Now, mind you, the fence is halfway across, whatever, but I realize that they're barking because here's somebody else to come play with. They're not barking because they're trying to scare me away. So I just, I greet them, hello, how are you today? Nice to see you. Yes, I hear you. And just talk to them. The teacher was walking by, and I told her this, and she says, oh, it's just like working with kids in school. I'm like, I guess so. So the idea is to engage them, and then you redirect them. And I think that's what you need to do when the kids are being that way. Engage them and then redirect them into serving others. They may not yet be ready to serve each other if they're angry and arguing at each other, but you can engage them in just doing some other kind of service. And eventually they learn that service for others feels better. And they will gradually come by experience to prefer that point of view. And then they'll have a habit of doing things that bring happiness. So that's one recommendation on working with kids. So our time has slipped by. Thank everybody for participating. It's been fun. And our mystery man, who I know who's been here before, slips in and slips out, but he comes and contributes and then has something else he has to do. So appreciate his presence. So shall we dedicate?
Yeah.
May my capacity for compassion be infinite. I dedicate these efforts to complete and total enlightenment. so that I may be a benefit to all sentient beings. May it be so.